And thanks for coming to work. This is work, right? My name is Bob Eklund. I'm going to be the chair for the next 2 days. This is going to be a series of presentations and, more importantly, roundtable discussions following those. I want to welcome you here on behalf of World Arena, Gabriel Webb and Adam Ozel, as well as the General Electric Company, Fluor, Mobile, Power, PW Power Systems, and American Chemical Technologies. I first came to Chicago in 1974 as a newly minted employee of the General Electric Company. They subsequently put me through graduate school at the University of Chicago Booth School of Economics, after which I left the company in less than 2 years because they didn't have me under contract. I've worked most of my career as a consultant and a contract employee, as a go-between between OEMs and utility companies. It would be fair to say, and I was discussing it this morning at the breakfast table, I've literally had a career, and a very good career, based on the electric utility industry in the United States and government regulation. Today, the presenters are going to come up. Years ago somebody told me that an expert was somebody who had traveled 50 miles and crossed a bridge. But I read the bios this morning of the people who were going to be presenting, and it's pretty obvious these folks have traveled much farther than 50 miles, and they've crossed a lot of bridges. So it should be a very good program. At the end of each one of the presentations, there's going to be a round table. And what we would like you to do, Adam Ozel will be in the back of the room with a portable microphone. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand, be recognized. Adam will come to you with the portable microphone, and we ask that you identify yourself and the company or organization that you represent. And before we get started this morning with Susan, I'd like you to all check your cell phones, make sure that they're on vibrate. Wonderful. And let the show begin. Susan, you're up first.
Well, good morning. I'm Susan Hedman. I'm the U.S. EPA Environmental Protection Agency Regional Administrator for the Great Lakes region and Great Lakes National Program Manager. If you've looked at my bio, you can see that I have spent a large part of my career working on the intersection between environmental and energy issues. So I'm very pleased to be here this morning to provide an update on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's proposed Clean Power Plan. I often like to start my presentations with a title slide that includes a satellite photo of the U.S. EPA Region 5 states and the Great Lakes to provide a sense of the geographic scope of the work that is handled out of the EPA Chicago office. Usually that photo looks something like this. But just in case you missed the background in my initial slide, this winter, the view of the Great Lakes from space looked more like this. As you may know, in a typical winter, ice covers about half of the Great Lakes. But this year, ice cover reached approximately 89%. Not quite as much ice as the previous year during the polar vortex, but enough to win the bronze medal in the annals of ice cover on the Great Lakes. So that was the local headline around here as we started 2015. But the bigger news is that NASA and NOAA recently confirmed that 2014 ranked as the Earth's hottest year since we started keeping records in the late 1800s, and that 9 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2000. Which brings me back to the topic I came to discuss today, an update on U.S. EPA's work to implement the President's Climate Action Plan, and in particular, EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan, which are creating opportunities to expand our industrial base, to strengthen our infrastructure, to improve efficiency and save money, to increase job security for U.S. workers, and to create new jobs in new industries that will sharpen America's competitive edge. As you may know, the President's Climate Action Plan was released in 2013. It calls on EPA and other federal agencies to take action to cut greenhouse gas emissions, to protect our country from the impacts of climate change, and to lead international efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon emissions are the biggest driver of climate change. Roughly a third of U.S. carbon emissions come from the electric sector, and a slightly smaller proportion comes from the transportation sector. EPA's work to improve fuel economy standards, starting during President Obama's first term and continuing today, is already reducing carbon emissions from the transportation sector, saving money for consumers, and creating U.S. auto manufacturing jobs. EPA's new standards will double the distance we go on a gallon of gas, and they'll help American families save up to $8,000 at the pump over the life of their cars. Our efforts to reduce carbon emissions and increase jobs are well underway in the transportation sector, but we are just getting started in the electric power sector. As the President's Climate Action Plan points out, at present, there are no federal standards to limit carbon emissions from power plants, but that is about to change. On the day that the Climate Action Plan was released, President Obama gave a speech laying out his commitment to take action on this issue and directing EPA to, quote, put an end to the limitless dumping of carbon pollution from our power plants, and to complete new pollution standards for both new and existing power plants. The President's Climate Action Plan directs EPA to work expeditiously to develop these standards. So, less than 3 months after the Climate Action Plan came out, EPA issued a revised proposal to set carbon emission standards for new power plants. Those proposed standards are practical, flexible, and achievable, and ensure that all future fossil fuel-fired power plants will use modern technologies to limit carbon emissions, such as carbon capture and storage. EPA's proposed carbon standard for new power plants requires new coal-fired units to meet a limit of 1,100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, and provides an option to give plants additional operational flexibility to average emissions over multiple years in exchange for meeting a somewhat tighter limit. The President's Climate Action Plan also directs EPA to take action to reduce carbon emissions from existing power plants. A presidential memorandum issued at the same time as the Climate Action Plan directs EPA to use its authority under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act to reduce carbon emissions from existing power plants. Section 111D is a Clean Air Act provision that has a lot of built-in flexibility that allows EPA to identify the best system for reducing emissions, taking into account the availability of technology, cost, feasibility, and the size of emission reductions that are needed. Section 111D also allows for state-by-state information to be considered and does not require a one-size-fits-all approach. That's important because opportunities for reducing carbon emissions vary from state to state, depending upon a state's generation mix energy infrastructure, and other factors. Another important point about Section 111D is that it allows EPA to consider health benefits associated with reducing carbon emissions and to consider non-climate related environmental benefits as well. Previous EPA standards that relied on Section 111D of the Clean Air Act have focused primarily on add-on control technologies. However, there are a wide variety of other ways to reduce carbon emissions from power plants. Techniques that are commercially available, technically feasible, and cost-effective. EPA began the process of developing carbon standards for existing power plants by informally soliciting ideas from states, representatives from the electric power sector and their industrial and commercial customers, labor unions, and non-governmental organizations, consumer groups, and others, so we could gather suggestions about the best way to proceed. We heard and agreed that a reliable, affordable energy supply is vital. We heard that flexibility is key. We heard and understand that power plants are part of a large, complex interstate system, and that we should allow for and even encourage regional solutions. We also heard about the many things that states are already doing. In fact, we learned that states are leading the way to reduce carbon emissions, especially through programs that encourage energy efficiency. 29 states have energy efficiency standards or goals, and 47 states have utilities that run demand-side programs. 38 states have renewable portfolio standards or goals, and 10 states have market-based programs to reduce carbon emissions. State and local officials told us that the impetus for these initiatives included concern about climate change, but also a need to respond to changes in electricity markets and recognition that innovation in the power sector is good for the economy. The information that we gathered during our listening sessions helped EPA to develop the proposal to reduce carbon emissions from existing power plants that EPA Administrator McCarthy announced last June. Here's the basic structure of EPA's proposal, which we call the Clean Power Plan. EPA has proposed a goal for each state to reduce carbon emissions. This goal is based on a Section 111D analysis to determine the best system of emissions reductions. The analysis in turn looks at what states are already doing to improve energy efficiency and to encourage reliance on low carbon resources. States choose how to meet the goal and will develop a plan to do so by no later than 2030. EPA used 4 building blocks to establish state goals. The first building block is making fossil fuel-fired power plants more efficient. The second building block that EPA used to establish state goals is using lower emitting power sources. For instance, increasing use of existing natural gas combined cycle facilities and dispatching coal-fired facilities less often. The third building block is using more low carbon and zero carbon emitting energy sources, such as wind, solar, and other renewable energy facilities, and keeping certain at-risk nuclear plants online. And the fourth building block that EPA used to establish state goals is using electricity more efficiently by implementing demand-side programs. It's important to keep in mind that states will have a lot of options for meeting carbon reduction goals. States will be able to use some or all of the building blocks that EPA used to calculate state goals. Those are the first 4 items on the list that's on the screen right now. States will also be able to include other carbon reduction measures in their implementation plans, in addition to or instead of the types of measures that EPA used as part of the building block process to develop state goals. A few examples of the types of options that states might consider including in their implementation plans are shown on this slide. It's important to keep in mind that states will have significant lead time to achieve their goals. The proposed Clean Power Plan establishes interim goals to be met starting in 2020 and final goals to be met in 2030 and thereafter. The states will have significant flexibility with respect to the timing of carbon emission reductions. For instance, a state could choose to meet the 2030 goal by making steady, incremental emission reductions each year by following the path represented by the red line on this graph. Or, as the S-curve illustrates, some states might choose to spend the early years ramping up their programs, getting fewer emission reductions in early years and more in later years. To provide added flexibility, the proposed rule contemplates allowing states to request a one-year extension to complete their compliance plans. And for states that are developing multi-state compliance plans, a 2-year extension is possible. The bottom line is that there is a 15-year window in which to plan for and to achieve state goals for carbon emission reductions. When fully implemented in 2030, EPA estimates that the proposed Clean Power Plan will reduce carbon emissions from existing power plants by 30%. These emission reductions will produce public health and environmental benefits worth up to $90 billion, benefits that far outweigh the estimated cost of meeting the proposed emission standards. States that rely heavily on energy efficiency to meet their carbon reduction goals will also help families and businesses reduce their electric bills. EPA estimates that states that include a major energy efficiency component in their plans will be able to reduce consumers' electric bills by roughly 8%. And as someone who worked as a utility consumer advocate before coming to EPA, I can't stress that point enough. States that choose energy efficiency to cut carbon emissions will save money for consumers. And that benefits everyone, but especially low-income customers who struggle to pay their electric bills. So even with these major investments in energy efficiency and increased investment in low-carbon resources, coal and natural gas will remain the leading sources of electricity generation in the United States. And EPA's analysis shows that this diverse energy portfolio will ensure adequate capacity across the United States to meet anticipated demand. Our proposed Clean Power Plan was out for public comment for 6 months, and EPA got a lot of comments. During the winter months of this year, EPA was busy reviewing and preparing responses to almost 4 million comments on the proposed standards for both new and existing power plants. That process is continuing through the spring and will continue into the summer. And since some of you who are here today may have played a role in filing comments on the Clean Power Plan, let me take a moment to assure you that we are carefully considering all of the comments that we receive as we work to finalize these rules. Let me particularly assure you that we have heard what commenters have had to say about deadlines for compliance and about reliability. EPA understands that despite our efforts to provide opportunities for flexible implementation schedules, that some are raising questions about the proposed interim goals that are part of the proposed glide path to compliance with final state goals. We also understand the concerns that have been raised about electric system reliability. And I want to assure you that we are actively engaged with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on that issue, and we are working to make sure that the final rule does not pose reliability risks. We'll be finalizing rules for both new and existing power plants in a similar time frame so that we can consider overlapping issues in a coordinated fashion. We plan to issue the rules in mid-summer, and also this summer, EPA will be soliciting comment on a proposed federal plan for meeting Clean Power Plan goals for jurisdictions that do not submit their own plans in accordance with the final rule. As we work to finalize new standards to limit carbon emissions from power plants, the effects of climate change are already being felt across the nation, impacts that are summarized in the National Climate Assessment. The National Climate Assessment includes data collected from 1900 to the present that tracks a number of indicators relating to climate change, including temperature, precipitation, and the increasing frequency of extreme precipitation events that overwhelm water infrastructure, causing floods like this catastrophic flood that occurred in Duluth in 2012. Extreme precipitation events also washed massive quantities of sediment into our waterways and washed fertilizer from agricultural fields, which contributes to algal blooms. This is a satellite photo taken at the time of the microcystin outbreak on Lake Erie that led to the drinking water shutdown in Toledo, which left about 500,000 people without drinking water for 3 days. Extreme precipitation events also overwhelm our sewer systems, resulting in sewer overflows that contaminate our waterways. This photo shows Chicago's lakefront after a combined sewer overflow. To address these problems, the President's Climate Action Plan directs federal agencies to work with states, tribes, and local governments to prepare communities for the impacts of climate change that are already occurring. We can prepare for the impact of climate change by putting people to work, rebuilding our aging water infrastructure, and installing new green infrastructure. We can reduce power plant emissions that contribute to climate change by putting people to work, reconfiguring power plants to improve efficiency, developing carbon capture and storage technology, manufacturing and constructing wind turbines and towers, building transmission lines, and fabricating and installing solar arrays. EPA's work to implement the Climate Action Plan is creating new economic and employment opportunities in the same way that EPA's fuel economy standards are helping to stimulate employment, innovation, and profitability in the auto sector. Some suggest that we have to choose between a healthy environment and a healthy economy. But that's just wrong, because a strong economy depends on a healthy environment and a stable climate. We can't have one without the other. So EPA looks forward to working with you to develop and implement solutions to the climate change problem, sustainable solutions that benefit our environment and our economy. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to participate in the roundtable or answer questions.
Any questions?
Any questions?
I'm Steve Courtney with CDI Power. I was curious, wondering why hydropower had not taken a little more prominent role in your efforts, and if maybe we'll see something more along those lines with the final rule coming out this summer?
Well, the use of renewable energy resources and low carbon or no carbon producing resources is certainly an option that states can use. I know one area in which we received comments over the course of the year was both comments distinguishing between low-head hydro and large-scale hydro and the contribution that each might make to reducing carbon emissions. Another huge issue has to do with Canadian hydro facilities and the role of electricity produced across the border by Hydro-Quebec, Ontario Hydro, etc., and what role that might play in compliance. And so that's an issue we're looking at very closely.
Any further questions?
All right, well, thank you very much. We do look forward to working with you. There are some very obvious opportunities for the natural gas industry in clean power plan planning.